Hi everybody. So let's see the practical project we are going to develop in the next couple of lessons. So the coding is in the background and this is the coding you will be learning. And when you run this app, you will see a dynamic user interface generated. What I mean by a dynamic user interface is, let's say if the user select a question like what is your gender, then it dynamically generates the user interface. And if the user select a choice and click next, it will dynamically figure out what the choice and store it. Let's say it stores it. And let's say if you select another question like what are the banks you are dealing with, then it shows a different set of user interfaces generated dynamically where the user can select, let's say, the options and click next, and then those options are again written or saved for future reference. And let's say if the user select what is your name, then it dynamically generates the UI. And let's say the user can type something from the keyboard and click next, and then that value is stored once again. So this practical will show you how to develop a dynamic user interface and how to access the dynamic user interface elements dynamically. When I say access dynamically, because when you click the next button, you don't know whether it can be a checkbox list or it can be radio buttons or it can be something else. So that is what I mean. When you click the next button, you will learn how to dynamically figure it out, whether it's a checkbox or radio buttons and likewise. So this is a very simple exercise, but it's very powerful and it will give you advanced knowledge about dynamic user interface developments. So we are very excited to develop this app, and now let's go and develop this app. Hi everyone. So the lesson is dynamic UI, simple example, part 4. So this is part 4, so you have to make sure you look the previous parts before this. We'll be using these tools in this lecture, and make sure to have these prerequisites before you start this lesson. So these are the areas you will be covering in this lesson, and for you to get idea about these bullet points, these areas, look at the previous parts where we discuss what these are. And as usual, it's going to be a practical demonstration. So now let's go and continue this lesson practically. So this is what we have developed so far in the previous parts. So now we have a dynamic UI where we can select and it creates a dynamic UI. And now what we are going to learn in this part is, let's say if you select, if the user selects some answers and click next. Let's assume this is a survey, like a survey page, like SurveyMonkey. User click next. Let's say we want to find what has been selected by the user, and let's say we want to save that to the database. So when I click next, I need to know which UI components are selected, right? And it should be dynamic because I don't know what the UI component is. It can be a radio button sometimes, or it can be checkboxes. So we need to dynamically find it. So that is what we are going to learn in this lesson. So to find that dynamically, what we have to do is we have to find and access the UI component. For that, we have to use access the placeholder, and there's a method called find control. We have to find it. But then to find the control, we need to know what the control is. It can be a radio button or checkbox. So that is why we use an object called ViewState to store what the current UI component is. So we'll be using ViewState to store it, so that whenever we click the next button, we can use that ViewState value and find that control from inside the placeholder. So let's do it practically now. So what you have to do is every time you are adding a control to the placeholder, you have to keep a track of it, whether you added a text box or a radio button or a checkbox. So to keep a track of it, you need to store that what object is currently in the placeholder. So for that we can use a view state object. We can use a view state object, and you can put any like key, like it's a key, let's say X or Y, whatever it is, but a meaningful name is okay. what do we want to store in a view state? Okay, I want to store what the control type is. So if it's a text box, I would like to say, okay, it's a text box, right? So then, for example, if it is a checkbox, as soon as I add the checkbox, I would like to, okay, what I should keep is, okay, let's say it is a checkbox. So now inside view state, inside the key control type, I am keeping what the current object I have added to the placeholder. So this is when you create the UI component, right? So now you know. Now I can keep it. But what is a view state, right? What is a view state? So a view state is a method or a mechanism to preserve, let's say, the value of the page of your page, and let's say whatever the controls you have, you know, inside your page, and it will preserve, it will keep that data, whatever the values of the page or the controls, between round trips. When you say between round trips, what it means is, now you know, when you create a ASP.NET web page, and let's say if you click a button on it, or if you click anything, any UI component on it, and if auto post back is set to true, now you all know with the previous lessons that it's loading the same page again and again. When you click a button on it, or when you click the drop down on it, it's loading your own page again, right, to the client. So when it is loading the page again to the client, what's happening is it sends a request to the server to the same page, and it loads it. So we call it as a round trip. So what view state does is, whatever the values of the page and whatever the controls, you know, of the page will be preserved, will be saved, will be kept between this round trip times, so that you don't lose the value. So in other words, uh, uh, now you are calling this generate dynamic UI every time the client selects a value from the drop down. So every time the client selects a value from the drop down, you are calling generate dynamic UI. So what should happen is, because the page is getting loaded again now, you need, if you are adding a text box, you need to save somewhere and tell, okay, at the moment it's in the placeholder, it is a text box, and this value should not be destroyed in the round trip. So view state will save this data in a round trip. So that is why we use a view state object here. So view state is turned on by default. It's active by default, and it will store the data or serialize the data between. It will save the data in every control on the page, uh, regardless of whether it's being used actually during the post back. So whether the value is being used or not during the post back, regardless of that, the view state will store the data, right? So that is why in this example, we store the control type inside view state. When I say control type, it's a key, you can put anything, so that we know what item has been selected by the client, right? So there are some important features of the view state. So as I said, as we discussed earlier, it retains the value of the control, you know, after a post back, without using a session. So without using the session built-in session objects. If you don't know what are session objects, look at our other previous lessons. So without the need of using a session, you can retain all the values. Then it stores the values of the page and the page controls which you have defined in the page. As I said earlier, it stores the values, and then it's very helpful and it's very powerful for you to get done your tasks. So now you know why I am putting this. So this value is kept. Now the advantage is, this is in the, I'm triggering this in the click event of the drop down. But now when it comes to, let's say when I click the next button, right? Let's say if I click on the next button, so when I click on the next button, which is, let's say the button, I said that I want to use this, find the value selected by the user. So when I click on this next button, now I can access the view state and find, okay, I can access the view state and find what is the current control. So for that you type this command, so which means from the view state you can now request the control type, because the control type is what you saved. Every time, inside that dynamic UI generation, into the view state, control type is where you put what the UI control is. So now you can get it directly. You can say view state control type, then you convert it into a string. So if I just access the view state, just to show it to you in a new line. So when I access the view state, right, so if I say, if I provide a key, what you can see, it returns object, because it can be even an object. It can be not just a string. At the moment what I have put is a string, but it can be any objects. As you can see, it returns an object when you give the key. So that is why I convert it into a string, because as I have stored a string, and then let's say I store it in a string variable. Now I can compare this string variable and find what the item, what is my current item, because it can be a text box, or it can be let's say the radio button, right? So let's say if it is a text box, because what I have put is, right, as you can see, I'm putting, okay, it's a text box. If it's a checkbox, I'm putting to the view control, it's a checkbox. View state, I'm putting it as a checkbox. So now you can put, see if it's a text box, right? Or is it a checkbox, or is it a radio button? So if it's a checkbox, or is it a radio button? So if the value is text box, then I know, okay, the current control inside the placeholder is a text box. Then I have to now dynamically access that text box object, because I have added, if you look here, if you know if the drop down value was a text box, what I have created is a text box object in the generate dynamic UI, and I have, to the placeholder, I have added that text box object. So I need to get this object, right? Or I need to get that checkbox list object. So I need to get the real object. Why do I need to get the real object? Because then only I can access its current value, so that I can get the current value and store it in a database or save it in a database. So that is why I need to access the real object, inside the current placeholder. So how you access is, you have to find inside the placeholder. So the command to find it inside the placeholder is, this is your placeholder object. Then there's a method called find control, and then in order to find the control, you have to pass a ID of the control. You have to pass the ID of the control. So what I'm going to do now is, if I'm to find the control by a ID, the easiest thing is, if I can have the ID of that object. When I say object, the text box or radio button or checkbox, whatever that object's ID, if I can have that ID inside the control type, inside the view state, then I can straight away pass that ID and find the control. So this is a technique I'm trying to explain to you, right? So because of that, in the generate dynamic UI, whenever I create a text box object, before I add it to the placeholder, I need to give a ID for the text box. And now when I add this text box to the placeholder, later I can find it with this ID. So, but I have to keep a track of the ID to find it later. So that is what I use the view state. So instead of telling it as text box, I can say okay, text box dot ID. So what I'm doing here is, what we are doing here is as the control type, what we store is the ID of the text box. So later when I access the control type, this can be even X, it's just a name. When I access it from the view state, I'm getting the ID. So now in the button click later, when I get the control type, now it's the ID. So I can straight away pass that and find the control, and it will get the exact text box object. But because it's returning object, I have to convert it into a, cast it into a text box and put it into a text box reference. So this is how you dynamically find or get to know what the current object is, what is the current object in the placeholder. So now temporarily, before I save it, if I want to see the value of this object, I can put it into the LBL answer I have below. So I can get the text box and get the text and display it in the LBL answer. The LBL answer is the label I have at the bottom in my screen. So this label I have below is the LBL answer. So when I click the next button, what I'm doing is I'm finding the control and getting the real actual object, the current object, and from the object I'm getting the text and I'm displaying it. So now if you run this, it will work for the text box. It will work for the text box and it will show you the current value of it. For example, if I type some name and if I click next, okay, now it says button clicked. It's still not showing the value. Let's see why it is not showing the value still. The reason is, now when I get the control type, now it's not text box, it is the ID I have given. So the ID I have given is text box 1. Right? The ID I have given is text box 1. So instead of telling text box, I have to see if it is the let's say if it is the, let's click this. So the reason why it's not working is because the way I have written the code, makes the placeholder empty, every time the page is loaded. Every time the page is loaded, it makes a placeholder to be the placeholder content to be 0. So basically what I have to do is slightly rearrange the code, slightly rearrange the way I have written the code. What I mean is, with the understanding you have now, if I put a else, you all know, okay, this else means this will execute if it's not a pause back, which means every time when I say if it's not a pause back, this means, let's say if user click the drop down, this will get executed. So what I'm going to do is, I'm slightly rearranging the code. I'm going to cut this from here and put it here so that it generates the UI every time the drop down is clicked. And in that case, I will not have to call it here because now I'm calling it from here every time the drop down is clicked or a button is clicked. So now if I run this with this slight change, if I run this coding, you will see now for the first time I don't see the text box because I moved the generate dynamic UI method into the else of that code block. So but if I select something, it works then, because now the page load works. If I put a text box and let's say if I type something from the keyboard and click next, so now you can see I can access the content. So it was a slight rearrangement of the code to make sure that the placeholder count or the content is going to have a valid content. But now what, as you saw when I run this for the first time, I don't see the text box because I moved that generate dynamic UI method away from here. So because of that, what I have to do is when this is loaded for the first time, I have to do the same slide technique because I know it's a text. First question is a text box question, so I'm going to put these few lines here. So I'm going to create a text box and I'm going to give the ID and I'm going to add it to the placeholder so that when the page is loaded for the first time also I will start to see that text box. So with that change, when you run, you will see the text box appearing now. And if I put some name and click next, so now it accesses the content dynamically. So this is how you dynamically access the content on a button click or something similar. Now let's write the code for the checkbox and the radio button very quickly. And that we will do in the next part of the lesson, right? So what you did now up to this is, now you know how to find and access UI components dynamically using the find control and how to use the view state. We did it only for the text box, but we will do it now for the other components. So these are the reference we use for this lecture, and make sure you look at the next part to complete this lecture. We are very excited to see you in our next lesson. See you in the next lesson.